Hi, sweet beans. Welcome back to Wild Geese. I'm your host, Anna. So I just got back from 2 weeks of travel, and I need to talk to you about the idea that the world is a museum of passion projects. I do think it originates from this tweet. The tweet's by John Collison, and it says, as you become an adult, you realize that things around you weren't always just there. People made them. But only recently have I started to internalize how much tenacity everything requires. That hotel, that park, that railway. The world is a museum of passion projects. I swear I remember seeing a Tumblr text post that was ranting about this a long time ago, about how every mundane little thing that you see, whether it's a tiny detail like a doorknob or an entire city, so many of those things very likely came from one person being really obsessed with how to solve a certain problem or something like that. I can't find that original text post now, but I've been thinking about this because when you're in a new place and there's so much novelty all around you, it's just a lot easier to be aware of that. Being in unfamiliar surroundings, it's so much easier to notice the way that streets are laid out and certain architecture. But even really small things like the bathroom tiles and street signs, they all kind of come into focus because they're slightly unfamiliar. And I was just taking a lot of pictures of these little details. And I was also reading Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel as I was traveling, and I'll get into that more later, but one character creates a museum of civilization, which is just filled with all sorts of little objects that we tend to take for granted and not really look too closely at now. And it just felt like this incredible time where I stepped completely out of introspection mode and was just in awe of all of these things that people have made, these cultures, these cities, these tiny, beautiful things. And I was kind of struck while traveling by how much traveling for me is just looking around and being wow, I want everyone I love to experience this with me. It can't only be me and my boyfriend seeing this. I want everyone to see this. I want everyone to taste this. I want everyone to experience this. And don't worry, this episode is not going to become just a diatribe about the merits of travel. I know that travel is not something that is widely accessible to everyone, but I kept finding myself saying my mom would love this. Oh, my friend would love this. We need to come back and take so-and-so here. And I know that there's reasons to travel alone. I know it can be a great growth experience, but there is that feeling when you're experiencing something so out of the norm for you, so unbelievably beautiful, that is I can't be the only one. It can't just be you. You want to share it with other people. And I know we do a lot of hemming and hawing about how people document everything online these days and how it's taking us out of the moment and whatever. But I do think that the instinct to share something beautiful when you're experiencing it is a deeply human, really kind of lovely thing. So I want to talk more about that idea that the world is a museum of passion projects. I want to talk about urban planning. I want to talk about introspection versus embodiment. I don't know, we walked around Amsterdam talking about moving there, how impossible it would be, how possible it might actually be, etc. But one thought experiment that was actually pretty interesting to me beyond trying to figure out visa situations was the question of okay, how could we bring the things that we love about this place home with us? How can we care for the home that we do have so that it becomes more and more livable? Not only survivable, but enjoyable, full. I felt my mental health was a lot better. And it wasn't just because I was on vacation. It was because of very concrete environmental things that I could point to and say, oh, that was a very intentional thing that someone made or implemented or made possible for these people. And it's not impossible for my loved ones to have access to that too. I want to live in a place where people feel taken care of materially and mentally. And that's why I'm happy to partner with today's sponsor, Grow Therapy. Grow Therapy is exactly what I was looking for a few years ago when I was looking for a therapist. I remember I actually made a video at the time talking about how absurdly unapproachable the process of finding the right therapist is when you're already struggling. Grow Therapy makes it 1,000 times easier by working with over 125 insurance plans, including Medicaid in some states. Sessions average $21 with insurance, with some paying as little as $0 depending on their plan. And finding the right therapist is a highly personal experience, so you will always have the freedom to choose. Grow Therapy doesn't do blind matching. You'll get to see detailed bios, specialties, and credentials up front, and you can look through over 25,000 licensed and thoroughly vetted providers, filtering by things like identity, gender, language, faith, and more, with options for virtual and in-person sessions. And bonus points because you can easily switch providers if your first choice is not the right fit. There's a lot of skepticism around online mental health platforms, and for good reason. But I trust Grow Therapy because the therapists on Grow are independent clinicians running their own businesses. They're not Grow employees. This is also not a a subscription service, you only pay per session. I love that Grow is helping us find great therapists without those spirals of overwhelm and anxiety that historically have come with that process. To learn more about Grow Therapy, head to the link in the episode description or scan the QR code on screen for a quicker way to get support and find a therapist. I'm just going to say at the outset, this is going to be a very chatty, freewheeling episode because I truly didn't ideate at all while I was on this trip. I didn't think about wild geese, and I'm basically recording immediately upon my return. So I'm just going to let you straight into exactly what I was thinking about during my travels, and it might be a little bit all over the place, and that's fine. But it's interesting going to these places with these incredible cathedrals and thinking about the people that built them, like the devotion involved in that, and also walking down the street and seeing very mundane things. Like at one point, I posted this on my Instagram story. I just took a picture of a bunch of lettuce that was stacked up on the sidewalk. And I thought it was so beautiful. And there was a guy behind me that started laughing at me for taking the picture. But even away from actual cathedrals and something so mundane as a sidewalk, I was just happy to take my head out of online discourse for a while, to see boxes of lettuce on the sidewalk and fun little chairs and cafes. We just walked for miles with no real destination in mind. And I remember the day before my flight, I went to a yoga class where the teacher was making a point to say, feel into what feels good in your body and lean into that instead of focusing so much on pushing through the hard parts and the friction and willing yourself to do something that doesn't actually feel good in your body. Instead, try to tune into what feels good and lean in. And I was like, hell yeah, that is what I'm going to focus on while I'm on this trip. I have been thinking so much about the balance between introspection and embodiment. And I remember I read this essay called Everything is a Win When the Goal is to Experience by Sentimental Being on Substack a while ago. And I just want to read the first little bit of it to you because it's been kind of following me around, just sitting in the back of my brain since I read it. It says this: last week I was peeling an orange in the kitchen, and I didn't mean for it to become anything. It was just an orange, slightly soft at the bottom, a little too ripe. The kind you're supposed to eat quickly before it collapses into itself. I stood there in my oversized t-shirt, hair tied badly, FKA twigs playing in the background, and the afternoon light was coming in sideways through the window, turning everything that slow honey color. I remember thinking I should probably be doing something else, something useful, something that could be named and justified. An assignment due the next day, an email, something that would make me feel like a person with direction. But instead, I was just there, cutting this orange into uneven slices like a child. And when I pulled one apart, the juice spilled down my fingers and stung a tiny paper cut near my thumb, and without thinking, I licked it off. No plate. No manners, just standing over the sink like some small animal. And the taste was so bright it almost startled me, like sunlight had decided to become a flavor. FKA Twigs was singing about how where the wild things are, I will be, and for a very small, very quiet second, I felt this overwhelming rush of being alive, like every cell was whispering, yes, 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 this is it. And it embarrassed me a little how much it meant, how something so stupid, so unimpressive could move me like that. Because if someone asks me what I did that day, I'd have nothing to offer, nothing you could put in a story, nothing you could post about, just, I ate an orange at 4:12 p.m. and stood in a square of sunlight and existed. But it stayed with me the whole day. And later, lying in bed, I kept thinking about that line. Everything is a win when the goal is to experience. And for the first time, it didn't feel like something pretty or philosophical. It felt practical, like instructions. Like a way to survive being human without constantly grading yourself. I recommend reading the rest of that essay if you liked that little snippet, because it's just a nice meditation on the pressure that we put on ourselves and how we can let it be so much more simple than that, more sensual than that. That's really what I wanted to bring into this time away, was the practice of feeling into what's actually happening in my body. Because I think I spend a good amount of time looking for instructions in the books that I'm reading, the media that I'm consuming. And that's not to say that instructions don't exist in those places. But this time away really felt like a moment to stop looking and start just feeling. And I had a very romantic notion of what that would look like, a very idealized version, I would say. I just feel so good and I would be free to do whatever I wanted for 2 weeks. What could feel bad? It'll be so easy to understand what feels good in my body and move with it. And that was largely true. Obviously, when you're on vacation and you're away from work and you're away from everyday life things, it can feel a lot easier to access that, but it's also you have to surrender to things in your environment that are completely out of your control, things happening in your body that are completely out of your control. And there were some moments when I really didn't want to focus on embodiment, Like, it was so hot in Paris for the last 2 days that we were there. We were lucky in that the first couple of days were pretty mild. And then near the end, we were catching on to the next heat wave. And these heat waves are political. There was a bit of grief because of these heat waves. And even now, I'm back in New York City and it's very hazy, bad air quality outside because of wildfires in Canada. And there are wildfires in France now. And actually, right before recording this, I found this piece of poetry by Michaela Angmere that puts this feelings into words really well. It says, "How many summers will I have with breathable air? Water I can swim in. How many more summers will provide bodily autonomy, the right to vote? There are already more data centers than summers I have left, more people murdered, more bombs detonated in Palestine, Lebanon, and Iran. Will the summers of my 40s see more wildfires and sunsets? I thought I had all this time, wasted it sleeping in, tried to ignore the inevitable, that those in power would rather destroy our land than do anything to protect it." And there's a good amount of doomerism in the comments that I'm not going to engage with, but we were sitting in a park at one point and looking around, and everyone looked so happy. This was on a day with pretty good weather in Amsterdam. There were dogs running around and a bunch of ravens just on the lawn. And I was just looking at all of this and I was it feels like this is the montage of the before times. And that's such a dark thing to say. Please keep in mind that I was also reading a dystopian novel during all of this. So that was just very top of mind. But it's also yeah, the heat waves are a product of climate change. The wildfires are a product of climate change. I'm sending all of my love to anyone who is affected by either one right now or any other climate catastrophe. I really wasn't planning on talking about this much during this episode, but this is where my mind is going because it's you have these plans to stay in your body and really feel into what feels good and whatever. And then there's a heat wave that is so stifling and oppressive and you're sitting on the metro and feeling like you're about to die with this tiny little fan just right up against your neck. And it is this incredibly bittersweet thing to be surrounded by so much man-made beauty and also know that a lot of man-made shit is just killing the planet right now. And stick with me, I am not going to stay in a place of despair about this. What actually happened is that I was feeling that way by the end of Paris. So we went to Paris for 5 days and then we went to Amsterdam for 5 days. By the end of Paris, I was dying from the heat. I was becoming evil. And I have a very hard time in the heat. And then we went to Amsterdam. And the overstimulation that I feel pretty much 24/7 in New York City just sloughed off my body. Is that a word? Sloughed? Dissolved. Whatever. It just dissolved off my body. The chronic headaches that I get, I didn't get a single one there. Things that I usually chalk up to just personal problems just kind of faded away in Amsterdam. And I don't think it's just because I was on vacation. They were definitely still there in Paris. I think it came down to environmental factors that really worked for my body. It's a quieter city. These people bike everywhere. There's barely any cars. And look, just like any city, I'm sure it has its problems. I'm sure people that live in Amsterdam could tell me all sorts of things that they don't like about it. But for me, for a few days, it was an incredible reset. It was very easy to lean into what felt good in my body because it felt like that was the dominant feeling there. And all of this had me and my boyfriend thinking a lot about urban planning. If you could hear us just walking down the street, probably 80% of our conversations were us being oh, this city works because there's less cars, there's better trams, there's no ads on the subway, blah, blah, blah. But talking about things like infrastructure. Infrastructure is something that is not inherently interesting to me until I feel what it's like to live in one city versus another. And start to get curious about why does it feel better to be here versus there? And when you feel in your body what it's like to be trapped in a heat wave with no air conditioning, but you also know that air conditioning is not necessarily the answer because it would just make climate change worse if every room had air conditioning. These are problems that start to become a lot more interesting once you've felt in your body what it is to be trapped in a heat wave. I think this is where felt experience becomes instructional. Like that essay was saying, everything is a win when the goal is to experience, and that feels like instructions. And what I mean by that is We spent so much time strategizing and dreaming up different ways that we could possibly move there. You know, the weather was so much better. It felt like it was less overstimulating. It felt like the perfect mix of like big city and small town that I've always been looking for and never really been able to find. But actually moving there would come with so many obstacles. We would be so far from family. The visa process is insane. How do you get citizenship? Blah, 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 on and on. And we were like getting so in our heads about this. But when I really rooted into my body, it was just this feeling of like, I like how I feel right now. And I think everyone I love deserves to feel this way. Even if Amsterdam is not like the place for everyone that I love. Everyone has different needs, whatever. But I don't know. It's just that was the core of it. And it's distressing, right? To be like, I want to live in this place so bad. This place feels better to me, all of these things, but I actually don't have access to this all the time. Like I actually have to get on an airplane and go home. And that's legitimately kind of upsetting. And I could feel myself getting so in my head about it, about like, how can I get back here without like abandoning everyone that I love in America and blah, 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 all of this stuff. But what I realized when I sat with it a little bit longer was like the fact that my home doesn't feel like that to me. Like my city doesn't feel like it like nurtures my body and makes me feel good in my body and all of those things. That is creative energy. Like that is a problem to be solved. And I can become obsessed with solving it. And some of the coolest people I know already are. Like they're already talking feverishly about urban design and walkable cities and all of this stuff. I saw this TikTok actually that made me laugh so hard. And it was this person being like, you know, if aliens came to Earth, they would actually think that cars are like the living entity and they're just eating humans. And there are some really big cars like buses and trains that eat a lot of humans. I thought that was really funny. But like America, it's a place that the vast majority of the country feels actually actively hostile towards pedestrians. That's why I've lived in New York City. I mean, there are many reasons, but that's one of the reasons why I've lived in New York City for such a long time is because it's one of the only walkable cities here. And it's funny seeing people from all over the world come here for the World Cup right now and be genuinely so surprised by how actually impossible it is to get around on foot. Like, I think that people who have never been to the US, aside from New York City, LA, Chicago, think that we're exaggerating when we say that it's not walkable, that you could have a distance that's like, actually it should be a 5-minute walk, but it is impossible to walk that distance unless you're going to walk over highways. I think that a lot of people thought Americans were just being dramatic when we said that, but then a lot of people came for the World Cup and were really surprised how true it was. I actually remember recently talking to my grandma who is obsessed with cruises, and I was asking her, like, what's your favorite part about a cruise? Why do you love a cruise so much? And she was like, I just love the ship itself. Like, I love that it's so walkable. Like, everything's within walking distance, and that's life-changing, even if it's just for a week. And I was like, oh my God, like, you want an accessible, walkable city. But America largely only sells that to people. Like, you have to find that at an amusement park or a cruise or like a vacation destination, not a real place where people live. And to be clear, America's car dependency is a result of a couple of things. It's not just Americans being like, oh, we love cars. One of which is actually segregation. And the other is that car companies created monopolies that bought and destroyed public transit. At one point, we did have public transit from Tampa to Sacramento. But then after World War II, suburban development basically blew up across America, which kind of spread everything out. And you had all of these low density neighborhoods that really relied on highway infrastructure to connect them back to the cities. And the reason why this is connected to segregation is because the Federal Housing Administration often would not insure mortgages for Black and integrated communities. So you've got all of these suburban neighborhoods popping up that mainly cater to white people. And they rely on highways being built, and that process primarily affected Black communities who had the least power to stop it. So one of the big reasons America is so car dependent is a byproduct of racism. Wow, I'm really falling into a rant about walkable cities and cars. But like, when I step away from my hatred of cars for a second, I can also marvel at the invention of a road. Like, I think of this video by Vsauce that came out 14 years ago, I think. It's called Why Don't Any Animals Have Wheels? And he goes through a couple of reasons, like the detached axle. Like, how do you get a piece of a body to be detached from the body, but also like part of the whole? But also it wouldn't really make a lot of sense for an animal to evolve a wheel because first you need a road. Like, wheels aren't very useful on rugged terrain, and like terrain that's found in nature. And then he asks, okay, so why haven't animals invented roads? And he points to Richard Dawkins' analysis of the wheeled animal problem that basically says that roads aren't selfish enough. Like when you think of the structures that animals build, like nests and burrows and dams, these are all things that animals can defend, and they're really only supposed to be used for their own benefit. But Vsauce says, quote, roads can be used by anyone that stumbles upon it while you lost resources and energy building it. The road is a really cool example of how humans got benefits from breaking the mold and doing things not just for themselves, but for everyone. Which I think is a nice reminder, because I think when we start to talk about human invention and things destroying the planet, such as cars, we can lose sight of things that were actually built from a spirit of cooperation and like reciprocity. So anyway, I feel like I could use this experience of traveling to a different place and feeling better there to mean like, okay, I need to start traveling all the time now, or I need to find a way to move there by any means possible. And hey, maybe I will if that ever makes sense for me. I don't know. I'm not going to speak for future me. But because that's not currently in my reach, and because I do wish to share these feelings with the people that I love, like I don't wish to just have that for myself. Part of it, like I was saying at the beginning, was that feeling of like, I want everyone I love to experience this. I want everyone I love to see this. I want everyone I love to know what it means to live in a city where they can walk freely and there's not 1,000 cars and it's quiet and, all of those things. I think this trip actually served as really good creative inspiration to go out into my own city and try to make it feel a little bit better. These are problems that I would like to put some real energy into solving, like the amount of noise pollution in the city, the fact that we're served ads even while we're like lying on a beach in this country, the fact that it's completely hazy in my city right now because of a climate catastrophe that's happening in a neighboring country. All of these are problems that I don't wish to run from, and I don't think we can run from them, But at that level, I think they definitely do feel way too big to solve, so they have to be like broken up into much smaller chunks. I remember a few weeks ago, I was walking around Prospect Park, and I was complaining about the walkways, like they're not well maintained, they're like buckling. It's not good for elderly people, for disabled people, even for me sometimes. I'm like, oh my God, I can't deal with this. And it was just like a small complaint that I didn't really think much of at the time, but the person I was walking with was like, that's actually the perfect problem to really put your energy towards solving. It's so small that it almost feels silly, but that actually is something that you as one individual person do have the power to move the needle on. Like you could bring that to your next community board meeting. You could do some research to figure out what needs to be done, who needs to be contacted to address that situation. If all of us chose one tiny problem and became like absolutely obsessed with solving it, we made it our own little passion project, like what would that do? Imagine what might happen. It's wild how much urban design and like these little details and even just more functional things like a walkway have such a big effect on our mental health. And according to psychiatry.org, urban environments with these features can have a positive impact on mental health. So green spaces, active spaces, social spaces, and safe spaces. Green spaces are things like parks. Active spaces are just walkable neighborhoods, like places where people can openly exist. Social spaces can be something as small as a bench. So when you've got hostile architecture that doesn't even allow people to sit down, people do become more and more isolated because it's not comfortable to leave their house. And then finally, safe spaces. And safe spaces are exactly what they sound like. They're just places where people are less concerned for their safety. So like if a street is closed off, that's more of a safe space. If there's like a cooling center during a heat wave, that's a safe space. So everywhere you go, you can start to become more aware of these spaces. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And cities are obviously not naturally occurring spaces. They're all incredibly intentionally constructed. Sometimes they're constructed by racist policies and bigotry that like echoes throughout the everyday lives of the people living there for years and years to come. But like if you pay attention to public parks for just a little bit longer, all of them have a history. So take Central Park. In the 1840s, the concept for Central Park was created by a poet named William Cullen Bryant. I mean, how fitting is it that it was a poet that dreamt that up? But then on the flip side, in order to build that park, they displaced everyone living in Seneca Village, which was this 19th century settlement of mostly African-American homeowners. They just evicted all of them in order to build the park. So like even the creation of our public parks is political. It's a very romantic notion to look at the world as a museum of passion projects. Like that sounds like everything is so cut and dry, like everyone's just making art all the time. But a lot of decisions are made in these projects that are not morally neutral. And it's complex because I can look at Central Park and say, I'm glad that Central Park exists today. But I also think that never should have happened to the inhabitants of Seneca Village.
I guess this is where I kind of diverge from the sentiment that the world is a museum of passion projects, because it's not just a museum. Like, if we look at the definition of a museum is an institution devoted to the procurement, care, study, and display of objects of lasting interest and value. But these things that he mentioned in his posts, parks, hotels, railways, those are things with living, breathing benefits and consequences for people. These are man-made things that aren't just to be owned and taken care of so that they can be studied or displayed. There are these constant conversations happening between people. They can be beautiful and life-giving, and they can cause harm. Like, two things can be true at the same time.
I don't really know where I'm going with all of this, except to say that, like, man-made technologies and cities and just, like, objects, things, are complex in their beauty and their horror. And there are so many things around you right now that had to be intentionally imagined and brought into existence, and they're really easy to overlook. It's easy to forget that we play an active role in all of this. Like I was saying at the beginning of this episode, I'm reading this book called Station 11 right now, which is a dystopian novel that is set like 20 years after and 20 years before a flu wipes out the population. And it leaves very few people left to fend for themselves and create their own little communities after most of their family members have died. And it was interesting because I feel like a lot of dystopian novels are very nihilistic. And this kind of felt more like a meditation on all of the things that humans have made and what would happen if most of the population was wiped out, and all of that like mass cooperation that goes into things like electricity, the internet, telecommunication, maintaining roads and sanitation. Like, if most people were gone and those systems of care were taken away, what would life look like? And there's a character named Clark who creates the Museum of Civilization, which is basically a collection of objects that are no longer very useful in the, like, quote-unquote new world. And it's interesting because it's based 20 years out from the apocalypse. So you've got people that remember life before it. You've got people that were really young, so they barely remember. And then you've got people who don't know what life was like before at all, and they just rely on stories. And I want to read this little part to you from when Clark is setting up the Museum of Civilization. For a little bit of context, they're living in an airport now. So it says, Clark took these artifacts back to the Sky Miles lounge and laid them side by side under the glass. They looked insubstantial there, so he added his laptop. And this was the beginning of the Museum of Civilization. He mentioned it to no one, but when he came back a few hours later, someone had added another iPhone, a pair of 5-inch red stiletto heels, and a snow globe. Carl had always been fond of beautiful objects, and in his present state of mind, all objects were beautiful. He stood by the case and found himself moved by every object he saw there, by the human enterprise each object had required. Consider the snow globe. Consider the mind that invented those miniature storms, the factory worker who turned sheets of plastic into white flakes of snow, the hand that drew the plan for the miniature Severn City with its church steeple and city hall, the assembly line worker who watched the globe glide past on a conveyor belt somewhere in China. Consider the white gloves on the hands of the woman who inserted the snow globes into boxes to be packed into larger boxes, crates, shipping containers. Consider the card games played below deck in the evenings on the ship carrying the containers across the ocean, a hand stubbing out a cigarette in an overflowing ashtray, a haze of blue smoke and dim light, the cadences of a half-dozen languages united by common profanities, the sailors' dreams of land and women, these men for whom the ocean was a gray line horizon to be traversed in ships the size of overturned skyscrapers. Consider the signature on the shipping manifest when the ship reached port, a signature unlike any other on Earth, the coffee cup in the hand of the driver delivering boxes to the distribution center, the secret hopes of the UPS man carrying boxes of snow globes from there to the Severn City airport. Clark shook the globe and held it up to the light. When he looked through it, the planes were warped and caught in whirling snow.
I love this message because it lifts that alienation that we can often feel when things, whether it's like products or food or whatever, just like shows up on a shelf or a catalog. Like, no, actually a ton of people and a ton of resources had to come together in order to get that there. Anything from roads to parks to snow globes to subway systems. And that alienation is by design. So that's why I feel like it's so fascinating to me right now to be thinking about urban design and urban planning. Because if we want to organize to fight things like climate change or to fight for land back or better working conditions, we've got to live in communities where we're regularly talking to our neighbors, and it's not just our individual fault if we're living in communities that are isolating us. I saw this TikTok by an urban planner who goes by John, and I'm just going to play it for you.
Now, here's the question being posed. When did we go from a casual socialization culture to a planned socialization culture? Everything that we do has to be done with intent. Even if you're a parent, you're planning play dates and hoping that you feel like going when it rolls around. You reach out to friends to ask them if they want to go to trivia night. Everything we do takes intention and plans, so much so that if you're an extrovert and your tank is full, it's probably exhausting the amount of work it takes to get us introverts out of the home. Meanwhile, if you're an introvert, you're probably not doing the work necessary to get socialized, so as a result, your tank is empty. Now, one of the reasons I feel like we don't have more casual, serendipitous interactions with our neighbors like we used to or like they do in other countries is because of how we built our cities. My closest experience to a casual socialization culture happened when I was in Barcelona. A typical neighborhood in Barcelona looks like this. You could live anywhere in the neighborhood and be a 15-minute walk from anything that you need to live: recreation, restaurants, shopping, school, church, etc. When it comes time to run errands, it often makes sense to just go on foot, to get exercise, to walk out. This is where you overhear conversations, run into people, see friends. And as an introvert, you think, that must be a nightmare. I don't want to see people all the time. But here's the thing. A lot of the times you don't like seeing people are in high stakes situations where you have to connect and make sense of it because you're not going to see them again for a long time. But in these cases, it's okay to just wave, to walk by, to not make much of it. But if you do have something to tell them, you can stop and talk to them. Now put a pin in that. We're going to come back to it later. A lot of people, when they pick up their kid from school and on their way home, pass multiple different plazas in which they can stop, let their kids play, get that extroverted time out while they sit at a cafe nearby and get some work done. As an introvert, I don't like going out making plans all the time, but in this situation, I could have ear pods in, be doing work, people ignoring me, but if I see a friend I want to hang out with or I hear a conversation I want to join, I take my earbud out and actually talk to those people. Now let's contrast that with the American built environment. You might have a 15-minute commute, but instead of walking, you're driving, and the isolation of your car works almost like a magic portal where you have no interaction until you arrive at those destinations. This has a couple of deleterious effects. One, you have no ownership of the environment in which you're moving through. As a person walking, you will take more pride and care more about what's happening there than a person who's driving. When you drive through a place, you don't care about it. You'll drive through places you would never be willing to walk through. The second negative aspect is you're not running into people serendipitously. You're not running into people casually. We've become less connected from each other, and because we're all individually making choices of when and where we go within the city, we're not running to each other as often. This is why we're constantly having to make plans and getting exhausted or under-socialized. And one of the side effects of this is not only that it's not working, it's also really expensive. Barcelona and Nashville have the same size population, but Nashville is 13 times the size of Barcelona. That means 13 times the amount of infrastructure, road, power lines, etc. Now, I'm not saying that you have to live in the city or that the single-family home should be outlawed. What I'm saying is that we should allow for more types of development, especially for the people who want this, if we would like to become more of that casual socialization culture.
I'm honestly laughing a little bit listening to this episode back because this must feel kind of irrelevant for anyone that does live in a casual socialization culture. And I know that not everyone in my audience is based in America, so this might not be like a universal problem that people are experiencing, but I still think it's relevant because the whole point of this was that like traveling around and paying attention to what was happening in my body gave me like very clear instructions basically for like what I wanted to put my creative energy towards. Disassociating from our own felt experience is incredibly understandable right now in this moment in time, but our bodies probably do have something to say to us.
I don't think that we come into this world with a grand purpose. I think it's like you give yourself an assignment. I think I saw that on the TikTok. I'm going to look for that and put it in the episode description. But I've had that notion that it's like, it's not about having a purpose. It's about like waking up every day and giving yourself something to do, like giving yourself an assignment, and you either show up for the assignment or you don't. You either make a good grade or you don't. Like you decide. And I'm also thinking about desire paths right now. I don't know if you've ever heard of desire paths, but basically it's like you have a paved path, right? And then everyone will start to actually walk the way that they want to walk. And this little natural path will start to form often through the grass that just says that like whoever planned this space got it a little bit wrong. And I just think it's okay to say like there are some things about our environment, our world right now that people before us have got a little bit wrong. Or a lot of it wrong in some cases. And I don't think the only solution is running from that. The desire to feel better in our body, to feel more embodied, and the roadblocks that we're coming up against that are problems that we can find solutions for. And that is creative energy that we're feeling.
And I think that's all I have for you today. Thank you again to Grow Therapy for sponsoring today's episode. You can learn more about them in the episode description. And I also have a 25% off code for Notability, which is the app I use to take all of my notes on my iPad. So if you like taking notes on your iPad as well, I would definitely take advantage of that while it lasts. I'll talk to you again in 2 weeks. Bye.